Well, I'm very glad to be here. I hope some of you will be. And since the topic of naturalism is quite a complex one, I think I will begin without much introduction. Now, I think, as many of you know, naturalists believe many things, but many of them don't believe in the existence of God. So let's begin by first defining a particular naturalistic postulate, namely that there is no God, and let's attend to it and note first that this particular thesis is of relatively limited philosophical interest and also of limited social interest or social significance. When in a given group many people do affirm the existence of God, then of course there's some point in denying it. There's also more point in denying the existence of God if many people base what is considered undesirable social policy by appealing to a thesis or to a belief in the existence of God. But obviously a naturalist who wants to oppose a particular thesis or a particular social policy cannot simply do it by saying that it's based on a belief in God. Because as many of you know, many people who are naturalists and many people who are supernaturalists both have the same social policies, or very often do agree on the same social policies, although not all the time. So we see immediately that there's one limitation in naturalistic postulate as we defined it thus far, namely, simply as the denial of the thesis that there is a God, or put positively, the thesis that there is a God is false. The limitation being that from this particular postulate alone, one can't really deduce or even justify very interesting social policies. There's another limitation which follows immediately, or, well, almost immediately, and that is the following. If you simply take the postulate there is no God, then after denying that, you can come and present a particular description of the universe which to many naturalists, or what intuitively would be considered a naturalist, would be considered unacceptable. Imagine a person who denies that there is a God, but then asserts that the world is so constituted that human values must inevitably win out. Or a person who denies that there's a God, but then insists that the world is so constituted that in the long run the rational will be real, or a certain particular kind of social institution must ultimately triumph. As we stated it thus far, namely, there is no God, a particular description of that sort is still not ruled out. But I assume that naturalists would want to rule out not merely the assertion that there is a God, but certain kinds of descriptions of the universe which presumably are compatible with denial of the thesis that there is a God. To rule such things out, additional things must be added to the postulate that there is a God, that there is no God. But how to rule the additional things out, what other things to put in, is not very evident. Often enough we read that a naturalist, besides asserting that there is no God, will then go on and assert that everything that is purely natural. But of course this isn't very helpful, because then he must go on and specify what he has in mind by something being natural, or what he is affirming when he is affirming that everything that is natural. So let's go to the third step. When we go to the third step, we frequently note that a naturalist who says that everything that is purely natural will frequently assert that everything that is locatable in space and time, or can be spatially or temporally locatable. And presumably on this basis, he would then say that it's impossible to affirm the existence of God because ostensibly God is not spatially or temporally locatable. You can't say that God's here or on 42nd Street. Given this, one could also rule out belief in the existence of demons. Presumably even demons aren't spatially or temporally locatable. Moreover, on the basis of this particular assumption, we may be able to rule out certain kinds of theses which affirm that the world is so constituted that human salvation is inevitable, because many of these theses were supported not necessarily by belief in God, but by the belief in spirit or belief in certain notions of the absolute. And one might say that things like spirits or entelechies, they too cannot be spatially or temporally individuated, or they can't be spatially or temporally located. And therefore we might say that the naturalist, simply by putting in this postulate, namely, that everything that is either spatially or temporally locatable, that you can't talk about any entity, that you can't individuate in space and time, has enough of machinery to rule out all of these other types of descriptions that we presented as possible descriptions for someone who would be considered having a particular kind of acceptable naturalistic position. Now, as it stands, unfortunately, this version of naturalism, namely that everything that is in space and time, is not strictly speaking acceptable. The reason I will give is, as it stands, a technical reason, and it may seem unimportant for the moment. The reason is the following, that many of the people who are naturalists will then go on and affirm the existence of propositions, or the existence of classes, or the existence of numbers. These particular things are not spatially or temporally locatable. Now, I admit the particular examples I gave are relatively special examples. These particular things come in as important if we're interested only in the foundations of logic or the foundations of mathematics. But though, as they stand, they are only of limited interest, nevertheless, they show that something has to be added to the particular kind of assumption that we made, namely that a naturalist only has to say that everything that is in space and time. Because people like Spinoza, people like Dewey, people like Santayana, who are considered naturalists, if not prime example of naturalists, did not themselves accept a particular assertion that I gave, namely that everything that is spatially or temporally locatable. So something else has to be added above and beyond this particular thing from which we began. But before we see what things have to be added, let's just pay attention to the thesis with which we began. Let's return to it for a moment, namely the thesis that there is no God. And as we state, as it stands, is of limited interest. But though it's of limited interest, I want to make 3 or 4 observations on it. Observe first that the naturalist, as I construed him, takes this particular thesis as a meaningful thesis. He thinks that one could talk about it as being true or false, that he can give certain evidence for it or evidence against it. As it stands, this particular way, then, of the naturalist is quite different than the way taken by some theologians, by some positivists, who seemingly would say that statements of this particular form, namely that there is a God, are neither true nor false. They're not subject to evidence. They're not subject to confirmation. They're not subject to proof. They stand in a different dimension or in a different area. I think that the naturalist has the upper hand here in this particular respect, namely that although some people might not take this particular assertion that there is a God as a serious assertion, and may themselves not particularly give any evidence or go further, they themselves may not, in point of fact, even give you the conditions under which they would accept or reject it and simply take it as a matter of faith and never say that and would insist that no matter what happens, they wouldn't give it up. Although some people have taken it that way, I don't really think it's true to say that the statement that there is a God inevitably must be taken in that particular fashion. And I think historically a great number of people did try to give evidence for it and did try to assert or deny it on the basis of certain appeal to reason. So I think that the naturalist who disaffirms the thesis that there is a God, or alternatively affirms the thesis that there is no God, I think is on good ground when he asserts that as it stands, it could be taken subject to confirmation or disconfirmation. Secondly, the naturalist, as I understand him, doesn't claim that he has a proof that there is no God, but simply that the preponderant bit of evidence is against it. And moreover, that most of the so-called proofs that have been given for the existence of God are proofs which are questionable. The evidence, of course, is well known, and the evidence against it, the problems about evil, the problems about the lack of ostensible purpose in the universe, and things of that nature. So that I think these particular bits of evidence with which you're all familiar are bits of evidence which the naturalist can appeal and has historically appealed. And I think I want to emphasize that the appeal to this evidence is important because lately a great number of people from a variety of areas and walks of life have sort of insisted that this whole area is not subject to discussion. It's merely a subject to acceptance or rejection. The third thing which I want to affirm on this point is the following. If the thesis from which we began is only of limited significance, then obviously if you deny it, you should really not think that you're denying things, that you're denying many particular deep or profound theses. If I say that, then ostensibly, not ostensibly, but directly, I'm at variance with a great number of philosophers and novelists and poets who have seemingly argued that once you deny the existence of God, there are a tremendous number of consequences that follow. For example, you hear the following thesis on occasion by some people who repeat Dostoevsky: if there is no God, then all is permitted. Or occasionally you hear arguments of the following sort. If there is no God, then ethics must be subjective. Or if there is no God, there is no basis for ethics. There is no objective basis for ethics. So so it seems that there would be many who would challenge the particular thesis from which I began. Namely, who would say, what do you mean it has only limited significance? Once you deny it, look what you have to deny, or look what you have to affirm. And I think many of the arguments that are given for these particular great consequences, namely, once you deny the existence of God, then these things follow, I think for the most part are arguing in a fallacious manner. Let's return to the first postulate, the one given by, originally, I suppose, it didn't begin with Dostoevsky, but he stated it most dramatically. I presume if you begin with the postulate, namely that there is a God, then you may go on and say that if there is a God, then there are some things which are forbidden. But obviously, it's only by a fallacy that you can then controvert and then say that if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Because obviously, it's like going, if it's raining, the streets are wet, then saying if it isn't raining, the streets aren't wet. The streets might be wet as a result of someone just going around and pouring water all over the streets. So it doesn't follow from the fact that even if you grant that if there is a God, then some things are forbidden, does it at all follow logically that if you deny the antecedent, you have to deny the consequent? As a matter of fact, what has to be said is something much more simply. If there is no God, then the whole question of being forbidden or being allowed just doesn't arise. There's no particular thing of, there's no one around to forbid, or there's no one around to permit on a cosmic scale. So the whole question of if there is no God, everything is permitted, or if there is no God, everything is disallowed, just doesn't arise. Similarly, on the second thing, you may believe that if there is a God, then there is an objective basis for ethics. But it doesn't follow that if you deny the antecedent, you must deny the consequent. As a great number of naturalists have really traditionally been people who've tried to defend, and defended with great subtlety, the possibility of affirming the thesis that there is no God, and then going a second step, affirming some particular version of an objective basis in ethics. As a matter of fact, I imagine historically, most of the people who have affirmed an objective basis of ethics have done it on the basis of appealing to nature, or appealing to a certain kind of view about nature, and have tried to base a naturalistic ethics or an objective ethics on the appeal to nature. So the particular thing with which I began, namely the thesis that denial of the existence of God has only limited significance and of limited interest, I think I still would want to maintain it, despite the fact that a great number of people have asserted again and again that it has a fantastic amount of significance, that once you deny it, a fantastic number of things follow. I really don't think a case could be made of that. A more limited case possibly could be made. Namely, there's some sort of psychological compatibility. There's some sort of psychological compatibility with belief in subjectivism and ethics with a denial of the existence of God. Or that there's some sort of psychological incompatibility in belief in God and a belief in objective ethics. But at best, this is a psychological thesis, and it doesn't really go through for all cases. For I think a great number of people who haven't had any sort of real theological commitments were really people who had deep commitments as far as an objective ethics were concerned. So I don't really think that one can make it even on a particular psychological rather than a logical thesis. So once again, we have to return to naturalism to see what it could mean if a naturalistic position would be one which would really be a thorough one, which would give us a particular Weltanschauung, or one which would be relatively thorough and have something to say about a wide number of issues and a wide number of problems in ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. And as I said in passing, one has to add to the particular thesis that which we began, namely that there is no God, and also to the thesis that everything that is in space and time. Well, what could be added? Let me suggest four, which have traditionally been given as important naturalistic theses. The four are: 1, mechanism; 2, determinism; 3, the thesis that all knowledge is scientific knowledge; and 4, the thesis that knowledge is power, or which is a certain form of meliorism. I think if you look through various types of approaches to naturalism, or people who've been considered naturalists, you frequently will notice that these particular people, whether they're novelists like Zola or Dreiser or naturalists in the 19th century, other than these novelists, Buchner, were very frequently considered mechanists. So and moreover, today, various people who are identified as philosophers or psychologists who accept a naturalistic approach to psychology are frequently identified as people who presume or assert that man could be looked upon, if you wish, as a machine, and therefore are very frequently considered mechanists. So there's some justification for the first identification of naturalism with mechanism, and I think the appeal to determinism is quite evident. Naturalists like Dewey especially have certainly defended the third position, the third thesis, that all knowledge is scientific knowledge, or at least have been understood to defend that thesis. And fourthly, I think all of you know that recent naturalists have very, very frequently appealed to the thesis that knowledge is power, or a certain kind of meliorism. So we have these four theses, which can be considered naturalistic theses, and I've tried to give some justification for considering them as naturalistic theses. Now, note first that these theses are not necessarily a compatible set, because if you take the third one, that all knowledge is scientific knowledge, it doesn't necessarily follow that that's compatible with determinism. One might say that as a result of a great deal of advances in physics, we now know that determinism is false. So if a person says that these particular four postulates are postulates of naturalism, it doesn't obviously follow that they're compatible at all. Let's go to so there might be an incompatibility with the second and the third, namely commitment to determinism. And all I'll mean by determinism for the moment is the simple-minded thesis that every event has a cause. Obviously, one needs a much more sophisticated approach for technical purposes, but this will do for the moment. So that we will have the thesis of determinism, which might not be compatible with the third postulate that all knowledge is scientific knowledge. Neither will the first necessarily be compatible with the third. If one looks historically at the first thesis of mechanism, obviously the first thesis was motivated by the great advances of Newtonian mechanics. As a result of the great advances in Newtonian mechanics, it was at one time believed that all the fundamental disciplines, that all the disciplines, chemistry, biology, the disciplines of the social sciences, that all of them will ultimately be reduced to the science of mechanics. Once you believe that all the sciences will be reduced to the science of mechanics, then obviously you will take the thesis of mechanism as cardinal. But if you don't believe that all of the particular theories in the sciences will be reduced to the science of mechanics, or certainly not the science of mechanics in the way it is formulated today. I mean, I don't really think that the people who consider the science of mechanics in the 19th century considered the possibility of a science which would have the sort of structure which relativity theory has and quantum mechanics has. It's a picture in which the whole notion of visualizing it in terms of machines just doesn't arise or make sense. So if you take the first thesis again, namely that all the sciences will ultimately be reduced to the science of mechanics, and mechanics given some particular kind of content, or certainly visualizable content, or that it makes sense then to talk about all the entities that are ultimately sort of machine-like entities. If you take that as your belief, so it's once again very, very strongly compatible with the third postulate, namely that all our knowledge is scientific knowledge. But with changes in science, one may be, if you wish, a little bit hesitant to simply affirm that all the sciences will ultimately be reduced to the science of mechanics. One may be very hesitant about it. So once again, there's a particular kind of non-necessary compatibility with these four postulates taken as a unit. Besides the incompatibility, let's note that as they stand, they seem to be a little strange. Let's begin at the last one, all knowledge is power, or knowledge is power, or that once we know things, then we're in a position of doing something about it, a thing which Bacon emphasized a great deal, and obviously Dewey and others in our own day. Well, as it stands, it's subject to a huge number of obvious counter-objections. We all may know, I mean, you may know and I may know, that we are all going to die. From the mere fact that we know that doesn't necessarily increase our power. From the mere fact that we know that if I will if I am thrown out of an airplane, I will fall at a certain rate. from that knowledge alone, certainly my power is increased. So there's an obvious counter-argument in the sense that all bits of knowledge increase one's power. At best, you can say that all bits of knowledge may increase your power, or may increase what you can possibly do. But between the thesis that all knowledge is power and the thesis all knowledge may increase your power, there's a big gap between the two, and it's not obvious to me how one qualifies in detail what has to happen before one puts in the exact conditions under which the sort of knowledge you have will in point of fact, or can in point of fact, be used to increase your power. So the fourth postulate as it stands isn't very, very strong, or it isn't intuitively to me very acceptable. Let's go to, it needs some qualification. I admit it's half right, but exactly how to qualify it I don't know. Let's go to the third. As far as the third is concerned, namely that all knowledge is scientific knowledge, I think that as it stands, it's of importance only if you're thinking of the knowledge of general laws. If you're thinking of individual assertions, or assertions about individual occurrences, or assertions about your own state of affairs, certainly if I want to say right now, I see that I have a finger, and I know that I have a finger, or right now you know what you had for supper, or you remember what you had for lunch, itsy-bitsy little things like that, which are things that fill up our lives. I think it's misleading to say that these are bits of scientific knowledge. And certainly knowledge of how to do things, how to draw a picture, or how to cook a meal, to say that all of these are instances of scientific knowledge seems to be, as far as I can see, stretching the use of the word scientific knowledge to the extent in which it's not useful anymore. At best, you might say that all of knowledge in some broad sense based on experience. But once you put it that way, then there's no need of cashing in on the word science. You may as well say that all knowledge is based on experience. So once again, the third thesis that all knowledge is based on science needs qualification. I think the qualification would be along the lines that all our knowledge of general laws, or all our knowledge of general theories, must be based on experimentation or statistical evidence, or certain kinds of control and survey. But that, I think, is once again a more limited thesis than the original one, which seems so important and so dramatic, namely that all our knowledge is based on science, or all our knowledge is scientific. Now let's skip to the first. I think the first one, namely mechanism, once again needs qualification, and the qualification that I suggested is obvious enough that instead of saying that belief in mechanism, replace it with the thesis that all the theories and all the sciences may ultimately be reducible to the theories of physics. This particular thesis is a very technical one, and there's argument back and forth as to whether or not one could show that there's good reason to accept it. I will merely say at the moment that there seems to me no good reason to reject it. So instead of beginning, so that we can have the qualification of the first, namely instead of mechanism, say that in principle all theories are reducible to physics. That seems to me okay, at least for the time being. I would qualify the third one, namely the third one, that all our knowledge is scientific knowledge, simply in terms of our knowledge of general laws. And I don't quite know how I'd qualify the fourth, but as I merely said, that the fourth needs qualification. What about the second, determinism? Well, once again, the sort of thing that we spoke about before, namely that determinism is merely a postulate which asserts that every event has a cause. Well, if you push it a little further, then the thesis suddenly reads that given any occurrence, by suitable scientific investigation, one can find a theory of a certain form, a certain deterministic form, which you can use to explain or to predict that particular event. This may fail, as it's failed in certain areas of physics. If you broaden it to say for any particular event you might find some theory to explain it, whether it's statistical or deterministic, then I think, once again, it hasn't been shown to fail, but it's not clear what you would rule out, or that you're ruling out there's a possibility of complete randomness in the universe. But when we apply it to human affairs, and we want to talk about human affairs and determinism, and we want to say, is there any good evidence to assert that all human action is such that we can't get a general theory which we can use to explain and predict every human action? Well, at this particular moment, all I can say is that the status, as far as I know, of psychological theories are really, well, so promissory, let me put it that way, that one can't come with a definitive judgment one way or the other. Now here you might say, well, forget about science. Just plunk. Make up your mind one way or the other. Well, if you do it that way, then of course, then you're denying the third postulate about the knowledge of general laws and theories. And then the naturalist, who isn't merely saying I have an a priori view, or I have a vision of reality, or I simply know, come what may, that determinism has to be true, but is saying I want to defend it on the basis of scientific advance, and then obviously he has to see what could happen in psychology. So at the moment, let's say that it isn't in yet, certainly if you could approach it from a naturalistic or a scientific point of view. What then can we do? Well, I think what we can do then is pay attention to naturalism or determinism, and whether or not naturalism or determinism of this sort, not whether it's true or false, but whether it's compatible with other things that we believe is true. A great number of us believe, for example, in human freedom. And we might say that given that we believe in human freedom, then if determinism is shown to be incompatible with human freedom, then obviously we'd have some good reason for denying determinism. So this is one way of judging determinism, independently of the third postulate, namely the appeal to scientific knowledge. And let's see whether or not one could pay attention to this particular thesis, namely the thesis of human freedom, and the compatibility of determinism with human freedom. Well, unfortunately, the word human freedom or the word freedom is used in any number of ways. And since it's used in a great number of ways, one once again has to begin by qualification, hesitation, and making distinctions. And I hope you'll bear with me as I try to make some of these distinctions. Now, one way of defining free is simply to say that a given act is free if it's uncaused. Well, once you define an act as free if it's uncaused, and simply say a given act is a free act if and only if it's uncaused, then obviously there's no problem. You can say, I believe in freedom. By freedom I mean uncaused, therefore it's incompatible with determinism. Well, then it doesn't make the problem of any interest. And the question then comes up, are there neutral definitions of freedom in which the issue isn't being begged, and we can then pay attention to whether in these neutral and other interesting senses of freedom we can see whether it's compatible with determinism. Well, one neutral sense is the following. There's a sense in which we can say A is free if A can choose. That's all. We want to say A is free if A can choose. In this particular sense, we might say that this particular bit of paper or brochure, it isn't free. The whole question of its being free doesn't arise, and the question of freedom arises if and only if it can choose. Moreover, we can say, as occasionally Sartre has occasionally said, we're condemned to freedom. What does it mean we're condemned to freedom? Whether we like it or not, we in point of fact do choose, or we have to choose. Now, if you do this, then you're saying the following. To say that A is free is to say A can choose. Then one can go further and say about human beings that it's a truth about human beings, that all human beings can choose. Moreover, you can say that this is a native capacity we have. It's a native capacity which is not necessarily to be explained by either social conditioning or anything that we pick up in our environment. This is sort of an innate capacity. Now, once you say it's an innate capacity, and then say it's not caused by anything in your environment or any social conditioning, or it's not learned, you might then say that this particular capacity, the capacity for choice, or this capacity which you now indicate as freedom, this particular thing is uncaused. But obviously, note, we're punning, and this is once again a pun. Determinism was defined relative to events, not relative to capacities. About the notion of causes for capacities hasn't simply been defined yet. Determinism, once again, was defined as every event has a cause. We begin with a notion of a capacity, that we have a capacity which is innate. From saying that we have this capacity which is innate, we might say it's therefore not determined by anything in our environment, or it's not determined by anything in our learning. But from this, it doesn't follow that it's uncaused. One, for a simple technical reason, that cause has been defined only through events. But the obvious expansion of the notion of causation is easy enough. Namely, that to say that a disposition is caused, or a capacity is caused, is merely to say that it has some particular basis in the structure of the entity. And as far as we can tell, the structural basis for this is quite obvious enough. Certain people or certain entities without a suitable brain structure simply don't have this particular capacity. So it's obvious enough that this particular capacity is caused insofar as there's a structural basis for it. So although it may very well be that in one sense we're all free, we can all choose, and this isn't due to our culture, or it isn't due to our upbringing. The same way as we all have a capacity to pick up a language. This capacity to pick up a language isn't necessarily caused, although which particular language we pick up will be caused, or will be due to conditioning. But once again, the capacity to pick up a language also has a structural base. So the first neutral sense of freedom, the capacity sense, the sense of choice, once again isn't incompatible as far as I can see with determinism. How about another one? The second sense is a sense of agency. To say that a man is free is to say that he's a free agent, not merely that he can choose, but other conditions are satisfied. Namely, one, that the particular choices he makes are based on the particular desirable feature of the objects or the situations chosen. And secondly, that he doesn't really fear the choice situation. Sort of this is a combination, if you wish, of Hume and Erich Fromm. So that when we talk about a free agent, we mean if he decides whether to take, once again, a simple-minded case, whether to go to the movies or to sit home and listen to the radio, let's say, his choice will be on the basis of what he considers the desirable features of the objects or the situation chosen, not on the basis of some features not in the environment. So if he chooses to stay home, not because of the desirable features of the alternatives, but because, let's say, he's afraid that his wife doesn't want him to listen to the movie, to go to the movies or listen to the radio, or he's afraid that this may, in point of fact, be against some particular kind of belief that his grandfather may have had. If it isn't based on this, then you might say he isn't choosing freely. He isn't a free agent. The notion of freedom comes in if it's done relative to the desirable features of the situation. And that if a person then isn't able to choose in terms of the desirable features of the situation, or between the particular things that he perceives as features of the alternatives confronting him, or if he does, he's afraid of making the choice, then he isn't a free agent. So freedom presupposes the knowledge of the desirable features, and presupposes a certain sense of ego, a certain sense of commitment to choice, and a certain sense of desirability. Now, once again, this sense of freedom is once again not incompatible at all with any notion of determinism. As a matter of fact, you might say it's dependent on it, because, as we very well know, the particular conditions that have to be satisfied before we have people choosing this particular way are not innate. These are not innate, and that's simply given to us. A good deal of training, and a good deal of, if you wish to use a word which I myself don't like, a good deal of conditioning has to go before we really insist that we can have people who are free agents in this particular sense. The third sense of freedom, not relative to choice, but relative to action. We might say that a man is free not when he chooses, but he's free to do something. So now we say a man is free to do this when he can do it. In this particular sense of freedom, I might say, I'm now free, let's say, to go to Chicago. If I want to go to Chicago, I base my decision in Chicago on the basis of what I perceive to be the desirable consequences or outcome of going to Chicago, and it's within my capacity to go to Chicago. Now, obviously, whether it's within my capacity to go to Chicago will depend on my social position, on the money I have, on how the economy is running, and this will really depend on a particular kind of power that I have, which is not innate once again. I certainly can't do it at will. I at will may decide to snap my fingers, but obviously I can't at will decide to be in Chicago. So this particular sense of power, the notion of human freedom, which is the sense of freedom that Marx and Dewey and Hegel had, that freedom is a certain sense of power, and freedom and power and capacity are interrelated. Well, once again, this notion of freedom is once again presupposes determinism rather than at variance with it. So now, these are obvious enough senses of freedom. Let's go to the fourth sense. We might say that a man is a free man or does something freely if while he's doing it, he's not following a particular recipe. So that we very frequently talk about the artist being free or a child being free when it's playing. It doesn't know in advance what it's going to do. It's completely creative and spontaneous. So if the child is being free, what he's doing is completely, if you wish, how shall we say, unpredictable. He doesn't really know what he's going to do next. It's completely creative. Now, this seems to be prima facie a notion of freedom which is incompatible with determinism. Why? A great number of people who insist on determinism insist that in principle, if you're a determinist, that in principle every act is predictable. Given that we see that there are free acts, artists are engaged in free creative acts, babies do very many free creative acts, they don't follow recipes. Therefore, there seems to be an incompatibility. But once again, the incompatibility is a surface one. Because no, a person who is doing a free creative act is himself not following a recipe. And this person himself isn't in the position of not predicting what he's going to do. From that it doesn't follow that the act intrinsically isn't predictable. So that, for example, many of you will frequently, when you know a child very well, will be able to predict the child's movements. Although from the vantage point of the child doesn't really think of itself as following a recipe. So there's very, very frequently this appeal to freedom, this appeal to the freedom of the artist, or appeal to the freedom of the child, because the child is doing things which are unpredictable, and therefore it seems to be unpredictable in principle. This is based on an incomplete analysis. It's shifting grounds from unpredictable to the child or to the doer to unpredictability in principle. We also now have the Stoic sense of freedom. The Stoic sense of freedom is the following. A man is free from X if he isn't dependent on X. So, if I'm not dependent, let's say, on the approval of my neighbor, I'm free of his approval. If I make my mind up without worrying about him, I'm free of him. Now, once again, we can go on and finally get to the sense of freedom. A man is only free if what he's doing is only dependent on him. So the freer he is, the less he's dependent on his environment. So I can snap my fingers at will, so therefore I'm freest in relationship to that. Well, as you know, the Stoics would then go further and further down and say, let's completely have our lives arranged so that all our desires are such that no matter what happens, our reaction will be dependent purely on our particular beliefs. Sartre somewhere says that the only thing we're really free about is suffering, because we can always decide at will to suffer. We're not free in relationship to happiness. Well, once again, Sartre is using this sense of freedom, which I specified just now, that freedom from, or not dependent upon. Well, here is a very, very hard notion to analyze, and I agree that there is no clear notion of determinism that I'm familiar with, which makes it very, very clear as to what it means when we say that this is particularly up to you and up to you alone, or that you can do it at will, so that I now can snap my finger at will. In principle, I think it's compatible with determinism. Namely, we could say all that this means is, if you desire to snap your finger, then you will snap your finger, and that you can give a causal law to specify the conditions under which it will occur. But here, although this seems to be a little bit of a ticklish situation, once again, a situation which is minor, it's nevertheless of importance. Let me reiterate. These grand senses of freedom that we indicated before, the freedom that the Marxists, the pragmatists were concerned with, the freedom that we were considering when we discussed the notion of power, the freedom that we discussed in relationship to choice, these particular senses of freedom, they don't really give rise to difficulty for the determinist. This last sense does, and the last sense comes up because, as far as I can see, there is no clear analysis yet of what we mean by the phrase, we can snap the finger at will. Now, once we do that, then, if we do that, and if we then build an entire psychology about things that we can decide at will. So if we believe in the Stoic psychology, we can decide at will not to be upset by things in the environment. If we can do that, if we believe in this psychology, then of course a whole set of assertions would give rise to difficulties, not simply the particular assertion of the form, I can snap my finger at will. But I don't think any evidence has been given for this grandiose Stoic claim, namely, that you can decide at will what your reaction to the environment will be. The Stoics also occasionally thought, and Descartes occasionally thought, that you can decide at will what to believe. Not merely you can decide at will whether to snap your finger, But assent or dissent from a proposition is up to you. That you can look and decide and ask yourself, do I really believe this? You remember in the Meditations, and Descartes begins by asking whether or not he really, seeing a man, really has to assent to the thesis that there is a man, or whether or not he couldn't, by asking himself whether he's fooled or whether there's a demon, ultimately see that there might be some good reason for him to suspend judgment and not to come to the conclusion that there is a man. A great number of works of Descartes are built on the supposition that belief is a matter of will. Otherwise, a lot of these particular things that he raises are really not manageable or too important. But I see absolutely no evidence for this at all. I dare say that no matter how many lectures in philosophy or classes in philosophy you take about the skeptic or about skepticism, I really don't believe it's up to you as to whether or not you believe that you have a mother or not. Or you can decide at will to doubt that you had a mother. You may not think that it's certain that you do. And you may have remembered certain lectures in philosophy or in Epistemology 1 that would give you good reasons for doubting that there is a mother. But I doubt very, very much whether these interesting issues are really up to you. So let me emphasize this point that although I do think the determinist has difficulty with phrases such as, I can snap my finger at will, a great number of philosophers from the Stoics on have built on this to a fantastic degree. And they built on it because I think they entertained a dubious psychology about the fantastic number of things which are due to us at will. Whether we can decide at will to believe or decide at will what reactions we're going to have. And insofar as they built these dubious psychological assumptions, I don't really think that they had defensible positions. And so that we're left with these relatively special problems about what it means that I can snap my finger at will, which are a difficulty for the determinist. The final sense of freedom is the sense of moral freedom. We frequently want to say that a particular person is morally free if there is no sort of rule that he is actually abrogating when whether he does it or does it not. So I'm free in respect to X. For example, I'm free whether or not to go for a walk or not to go for a walk, if it's up to me. There's, so to speak, no moral principle. There's no moral principle. We're all free. There's no moral principle that I'm abrogating or following, insofar as I decide one way or another. Here's a sense which a great number of people have believed, the sense of moral freedom. The sense that we're all morally free. It's ultimately up to us. There's, so to speak, no objective basis for deciding one way or another in relationship to decisions, whether the decisions are right or wrong. Now, once again, the notion of moral freedom is a very complex notion, and hinted in the beginning, although many people believe that once you deny the existence of God, you must affirm moral freedom. I don't think that's true at all. It doesn't follow at all that you have to say it's completely up to us, and there's no sense in which you can say certain actions are right or wrong if you don't believe that no action is intrinsically right or wrong, simply for the denial of theism. But even if you grant moral freedom, namely that's completely up to us morally, that whatever choice we make is a choice that we made, it doesn't follow that the particular choice we made was not caused. Don't forget, now there's a pun of up to us. To say that something is up to us may merely mean that we're the ultimate justification. There's no other justification that can be given, or our assent is the ultimate justification. This, if you wish, is a normative thesis. A normative thesis as to what's right or wrong. It's not at all a thesis about cause. It doesn't say that our decision is uncaused, that it was merely up to us in the same sense in which my snapping my finger was up to me, and it might be completely uncaused and not be subject to a particular kind of deterministic analysis. Now, it's this last sense of moral freedom, that it's up to us morally, and that we're free agents in this sense, which has frequently given rise to a thesis or a belief that naturalism is incompatible with the notion of human freedom, because I think there's been a systematic ambiguity of the notion of up to us in the sense in which my snapping my finger may be up to me, and up to us in the sense that there's no authority who can then come and say what I did was morally right or wrong. I tried to specify a number of senses of determinism, a number of senses of freedom. And I try to indicate that the senses of freedom that have been given are such that except for the first one, namely when you flatly assert that to be free is to do an act which is uncaused, and this sense that we've given the one before last, namely that there are certain things which are up to us, which are very, very hard to analyze, namely up to us in the sense that we can do them at will, that except for this particular sense, it seems to me that there is no overwhelming problem for a determinist, and that determinism therefore is compatible with most senses of human freedom, which are of deep significance and over which we very, very frequently are concerned with. Why then has there been the feeling, the widespread feeling frequently given, that naturalism or versions of naturalism are incompatible with human freedom? Are they simply based on a mistake? Well, I really don't think so. I think that the issue is another one entirely. I mean, if one reads people like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, or Sartre, one frequently feels that they've said something which seems to be at variance with the naturalist, and that what they're saying is true. And although if what they're saying is true and simultaneously they're affirming human freedom, and the senses that I've given of human freedom are compatible with determinism, then either they're introducing another sense of human freedom that I haven't captured as yet, which is possible, or that the issue really hasn't been joined yet. And I think the issue hasn't been joined. I think that what's up is the following, that it's not, so to speak, the naturalist affirmation of freedom or of determinism that's crucial. It's what a great number of people believe to be the naturalist explanation of choices that's being contested. If you look at a great number of people in the 19th century, you will frequently see them talking, you will frequently note that they talk along the following line, that whenever we choose and we're rational, we're really choosing. And we're rational free agents in the second sense that we spoke about before. Namely, it's not going through the mechanics of choosing, but all the time, to use the current jargon, other directed or guided by fears, conscious or unconscious fears. We're really free. We're doing it on basis of the desirable properties of the outcome. If you look at that, you will frequently find that they will then generalize and say that actually all choices are such that whenever we choose in terms of the outcomes, and only the outcomes, and all that we desire are the outcomes. So that, for example, if I'm choosing between, let's say, going to the movies or going to, or staying home once again and looking at TV, what I really want is this particular outcome, one or the other. And then if by hypothesis someone comes along and says, well, look, I'll take you to the movies, then that's enough. Putting it alternatively, the act of choice is itself not motivated. That there's no real motivation for the act of choice. That choosing itself isn't something that we want. That choosing, if you wish, is derivative. And that to use the current terminology, the utilities that we assign, the things that we prefer, are the preferences are to the outcomes. The utilities are not to the particular situation of choosing itself. Now, it's this particular kind of naturalistic approach, namely, that choice itself is not intrinsically motivating, or choice itself for many of us doesn't have direct utility, is, I think, very often some things that you find contested in people in Kierkegaard and Sartre and in Dostoevsky. And you frequently find, especially when Dostoevsky gives you the example of someone who would be given a great deal of money and may decide just to take the money and throw it away just so that he can say he's finally chosen something and given a certain kind of utility merely to the act of choice. Given this particular thing, you can take this as a prime example of someone who will come to the conclusion that it's a mistake in principle to say that choice itself has no particular utility, or that's not what we're motivated for. The whole theory of motivation is only in terms of the outcome. Now, insofar as naturalists like Mill have asserted that, I think they're wrong. I mean, it's obvious they're wrong. Not on the four postulates that we gave above, but on the postulate of a certain theory of human psychology, or a certain theory of human motivation. But I think the converse error was made by Dostoevsky. Because let's say, for the sake of argument, that when you do decide to go to the movies, the particular total situation has utility for you as a total complex. It's not simply going to the movies that has utility for you. It's going to the movies because you chose to go to the movies that has utility for you. And you may resent if someone just picks you up and takes you to the movie. Just being at the movie isn't the thing you want. It's being into the movie given that you've chosen to be in the movie. And so therefore the choice itself has some direct utility or some preference and to you. From which it doesn't follow, as occasionally Dostoevsky has said, that choice or the mere act of choice, that itself in the abstract has utility. It has nothing to do, as it were, with the consequences for many of us. It's mere choosing. That's what we desire most, simply choosing. Or very, very frequently you have a great deal of the existentialist emphasis on the notion of motivation. That it's the act of choice which is so central and which is so crucial to the human condition. Well, I think this is, as far as I can tell, and here obviously I'm stepping into an area which is an area primarily of human motivation rather than something that can be decided purely by logical analysis. I think, as far as I can see, both sides are in error. Because if I'm right, it's this complex thing which you can't divide in two. And to say that I merely want to choose, but not tell you what are the alternatives between I'm choosing, but I simply have a direct utility for choosing. That's all. I think almost doesn't make sense. What you really want, I think, or most of us want to have, is a certain kind of life in which the options that we're choosing between are desirable, and a life in which the options we're going to get will be the options we get as a result of our choice. It doesn't mean that we want simply to choose in a vacuum without knowledge of the options between which we're picking. And the emphasis on choice in itself, or outcomes in themselves, both of them seem to me a false emphasis. So let me try to summarize what I've tried to say tonight. There's one thesis of naturalism in relationship to some version of the denial that there is a God, which, if you wish, is pretty much identical with subversions of atheism, which I myself don't at this stage of the game find fantastically exciting or important. And I try to give some reasons because I think it's of only limited philosophical interest. If you broaden naturalism in the four ways which I've specified, then I think all the four ways, with the four postulates, need qualification. It's not enough at this stage of the game to talk about mechanism. I think it's misleading merely to say that all our knowledge is scientific knowledge. And neither is it correct to say that knowledge in itself increases power. What I think and finally, I don't see how one can decide in relationship to a particular kind of determinism, which is to be decided without science. What I've tried to see is to whether or not there's some version of naturalism which can be shown to be compatible or incompatible with determinism. I try to indicate one or two versions of determinism which are philosophically important, and whether these particular versions of freedom, I tried to give two senses of freedom which may not be compatible with determinism, but as far as I can tell, most of the important, interesting senses of freedom and most of the important theses in which we talk about freedom are senses which are compatible with naturalism. What I think has been historically, at least for the last 50 years, the great attack on naturalistic versions of determinism are really attacks, as far as I can tell, when they're important and interesting, on certain kinds of theories of motivation that a lot of the naturalists have given. And insofar as some of these theories are wrong, naturalism or naturalistic theories are wrong. But I think that some of the critics have made the converse error. I've just emphasized the notion of choice rather than the choice in relationship to choosing among alternatives that have properties that we consider desirable properties. I think by now, I hope that the secret is out that I'm really talking as a member of the in-group. I consider myself a naturalist, and some of these particular objections I gave may to some of you seem to be relatively minor. If they are, if I may say so, thank God, because I think that naturalism, by and large, is a particular approach which I think is a suitable one and an acceptable one, but certainly the way it's been handed down to us, even by such important writers as Dewey, is certainly not a finished form and needs certain kinds of qualifications, and I've tried to indicate some of the qualifications.